2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9, you might think about that as one unit. It deals with what Paul describes as the ministry to the saints. You look in chapter 8 and verse 4, the last few words there, the ministering to the saints. Chapter 9 and verse 1, as touching the ministry to the saints. Now, before that may have been a little bit foggy or sketchy for us. But what saints here is this specific ministry applied to? Jerusalem, that's right. We read there are 4 chapters. Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8, and 2 Corinthians 9 deal with what we sometimes call the Great Contribution, where the poor among the saints in Jerusalem were in need, and Paul was going among these congregations, appealing to them to give assistance. And so last week in our study of chapter 8, verses 1 to 5, Paul mentioned about the manner in which group of churches participated in that activity. Churches of Macedonia. And as far as their own personal financial status, they were in deep poverty. But they gave out of joy, they gave willingly, and Paul said, man, they gave even beyond their ability. And one of the keys to that was they first gave themselves to the Lord. Well, what had happened was the brethren in Corinth, a year before Paul wrote this letter, had signed on, so to speak. They had agreed to send some help over there to Jerusalem, to the poor among the saints. And so Paul went with that message to the churches of Macedonia and said, hey, our brethren down in Corinth, they're going to be involved. Why don't you do that? And they said, okay, we will. And now then he turns around and uses the church of Macedonia to encourage the brethren in Corinth to give. And so that's kind of where we left it last week. If I'm not mistaken, we got down through verse 15 of chapter 8. Does that sound right? Now, the end of chapter 8 is pretty easy. Well, let me say this. When you think about all the book of 2 Corinthians, this is one of the easier sections. It deals with Titus and 2 other brothers whose names are not given in this text. But they were going to be involved in helping the churches get their collections together. You know, the passage we often use in regard to giving, 1 Corinthians 16:2, upon the first day of the week. Well, you go back before that to verse 1 in 1 Corinthians 16. Now, concerning what? The collection for the saints. And you and I know what that means now. It's for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. And Paul says, as I've given order to the churches of Galatia, you do the same thing. I want to read tonight just verses 18 to 24, and we'll come back and look at our questions. Then we will march into chapter 9. Verse 18, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And we have sent with him, well, I should say 16, apologize. Go back to 16. But thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care into the heart of Titus for you. For indeed he accepted the exhortation, but being more forward or diligent of his own accord, he went into you. And we have sent with him the brother. So this is an additional person. What about this brother? Well, his praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. And not that only, but who also was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace, which is administered by us, to the glory of the same Lord in declaration of your ready mind. Avoiding this, that no man should blame us in this abundance or lavish gift, which is administered by us, providing for honest or honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. And we have sent with them is plural, right? So it's Titus plus brother number 1. Paul said we've sent an additional brother, whom we have oftentimes proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent upon the great confidence which I have in you. Verse 23. Whether any do inquire of Titus, He is my partner and fellow helper. Concerning you or our brethren be inquired of, they are the messengers of the churches and the glory of Christ. Wherefore show you to them and before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. Now, in the context, Paul's appeal for them to show the proof of their love was specifically talking about what mattered. Their contribution for this cause. We know the principle. We show our love for God by how we respond to His commands. Okay? By keeping His commands. But in this context, proof of their love is in their contribution. Now, this man Titus, he's had a connection with the church in Corinth, right? Paul had sent Titus down there to see how things were going. And after Titus had been to Corinth, he met up with Paul. And after that, Paul wrote this letter. There was a good connection between Titus and the brethren there. And Paul's asking Titus to go back and be involved again. You know what's interesting about Titus, to me at least, in the New Testament, every time that Titus is mentioned, it's always in connection with the Apostle Paul. He's either with Paul, or he's doing something for Paul, or Paul's writing to him. And another matter that's interesting to me is Titus is not mentioned in the book of Acts. That doesn't mean he's not an important character, but he's not mentioned in the book of Acts. So, we read in 1 Corinthians 16 when Paul wrote that letter to the church in Corinth, he says, when I come, if you have somebody you want to send along with me, he said that'd be good. And so the appearance is that the individual congregations who were sending their contribution to Jerusalem, they were sending one of their representatives, a messenger, a money carrier to go along. Not only to represent their interest, but in terms of a matter of safety, okay, for those who are carrying that money. Let's take a look at our questions then. Number 13, page 30. What had Titus done which showed his earnest care for the church in Corinth?
He went there out of his own accord.
Yes, it was not simply because Paul wanted him to go, but he was willing to go. His heart was in it. And it's one thing to do something out of a sense of duty, but it's another thing when we do something and, as we say, our heart is really into it. And that's what Titus was. And you could understand then from Titus's character and his attitude why Paul would be, glad to have Titus involved in this. We observed last time, Paul's like the rest of us. He couldn't be every place at one time. And so it's pretty common in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, and in the letters we read that Paul wrote, Paul's in one place, and he asks this brother, sends this brother over here to carry out some task, on his behalf. And Titus certainly had Paul's confidence, okay? So on the one hand, Paul had encouraged him to go, but Titus basically was, I want to go, okay? All right, number 14. Who else had accompanied Titus when he went to Corinth to take care of certain matters? Yeah, what does Paul say about him? He's highly what? Praised. No, he's well respected among the churches. Doesn't mean he was seeking the praise of men. There were some in the time of Jesus that they believed that he was the Son of God, but they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God, so they wouldn't confess it. The indication is not these people were seeking praise, but by his conduct, he had shown his character. And the brethren spoke well of him. And then the second brother that's mentioned in verse 22, what had he shown in his life? Diligent. And so, again, the word that keeps, coming to mind is the word faithful, reliable, dependable. When you and I have some important task to be carried out, especially one that involves finances, what kind of person are we going to call to take care of that activity? Someone who what? Honest. Somebody got confidence in. Somebody's got a good track record. And so you understand why these were chosen. Now, in our Bibles, in verse number 23, these brethren are called messengers of the churches. Does anybody's Bible have a footnote, a little explanation, this word messengers? Anybody? Well, it's okay. In our booklet we have it. So look under question 14, if you would, in our booklet. Right between question 14 and 15. Paul refers to these brothers as messengers of the church. The word messengers is from the Greek word apostolos. What does that sound like? Apostle. And so our question is, in what sense were these brothers mentioned here? In what sense were they apostles? Well, you go back to the root meaning of the word apostle. What does that word mean? It means a messenger. One who's sent to carry out a task. We often think about the original 12 and then Matthias and Paul who were added. That would be a specific use of that word apostle, reference to them. But look over, I've got the references here. Look over in the book of Philippians, and it doesn't come across in the English Bible, but in the Greek Bible, here's a man by the name of Epaphroditus, who in the Greek New Testament is called an apostle. Philippians 2:25. Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, and companion in labor and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants. It doesn't mean that he was on the level of the special apostles in terms of authority and power. He wasn't. But he was one whom the church at Philippi had sent on a mission. And that's all it meant. And then the other reference here in our booklet is Jesus was an apostle. Why? He was sent as a messenger of God, sent on a special mission. Okay? So that's just interesting. That's just interesting. Okay, now come back then to our text, question number 15. We read here in verse number 21 that Paul says, as we're taking care of this activity, getting your money and the money from other places over to the poor among the saints, we're doing our best to provide for things honorable or honest in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. You know, sometimes there may be something done or said. Somebody said, well, you know, the only thing that really matters is what God thinks about it. Now, if you're talking about is a message true or not true? Well, what matters is what God says. That's true. But you know, there's sometimes we need to take into account what are other people going to think about this? How's that going to come across if we do this in this way, if we say this in this way? Look at question 15. In the context, to what does Paul refer when he speaks of the need to provide things honorable or honest in the sight of God and humans? In what manner?
How the money was taken back to the people.
Yes. How that money was collected and transported and handed off to the brethren over in Jerusalem. Just so that things would be what? That everybody know everything's above board. And look, sometimes when finances are involved, it can be a delicate matter. We just need to do everything within our power to let people know that, look, the books are open and we're going to make certain that every single penny is accounted. It's around $25,000. We want to know specifically. We contributed. And by contributing, we're participants in that, right? We're sharers in that activity. Now, this word here, again, the King James is honest, the New King James is honorable. That's a word that's used many times in the New Testament. And sometimes it's just the idea of good. Let me give you an example. Here's a verse, the wording sounds familiar to all of us. if any man desire the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. Same word, same Greek word. Good, a beautiful appearance. The same thing with the word honest and the word honorable here. Okay? And so I would say Paul and these men, they went out of their way to make certain that there would be no doubts and there would be no questions. Now, final question number 16. In connection with Paul's dealings and work with the congregation in Corinth, what role did Titus play? Paul describes him as a what? Partner and a what? Fellow helper or fellow worker. That's it. Paul didn't consider himself to be above Titus or anybody else. And so, again, it really speaks well of Titus that Paul had that confidence in him and was willing to turn these tasks over to him. So, guess where we start in chapter 9? We're back to the thing we talked about in chapter 8. How long had it been since the brethren in Corinth had said, Paul, you can count on us? Been a year. Now, 3 out of every 4 years, that means 365 days. That's a long time. That's a long time. So if you look in our booklet at page 31 at the little overview of the chapter, really simple. Verses 1 to 5 are plea to the saints in Corinth to get their contribution ready before Paul comes. And if it's not ready when he gets there, it's kind of like, that'd be embarrassing for you, and that'd be embarrassing for me. Paul's going to use a number of different ways. I wouldn't say to shame them into giving, but to encourage them to step up and do what they pledged to do. Look, if a year before this they said, Paul, we don't think it's going to work out, let's move on. But y'all said you were going to do it. Okay, so let's do it. And then God loves and blesses those who are cheerful givers. Okay? Because of the time situation, let's kind of stick with the questions tonight. We'll expand as we go through these. Okay? This thing where Paul's appealed to these churches. Now, again, you tell me. We kind of walked through it earlier. Name some of the different congregations that were involved in sending a contribution over to the Jerusalem area. Who were some of those? So you're the churches of Macedonia, right? That we know the Thessalonica, Philippi, and Berea. What else we got besides the Macedonian churches? Galatia. And then the appeal here is for Achaia and Corinth. Go back over and look in Romans 15 again. We read it last time. But you know what happens when it's been 167 hours since you read something. Romans 15. When Paul writes this letter, he's not asking, at this point, he's not asking for more assistance. He's basically saying, we got it together, now we're going. Verse 25. But now I go into Jerusalem to minister unto the saints. How? To take this collection. We talk about Paul, verse 26. For it pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia. Achaia would include Corinth, it would include Athens, it would include Cenchrea, to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. And if we were to read on in Romans 15, a couple of things. Number one, this really made Paul happy. Why? Why would that be such a pick-me-upper to Paul? Because of their hearts and because of the racial difference. Those brethren in Jerusalem either completely or almost completely would be Jewish brethren. And the congregations that were sending assistance, they may have had some Jewish brethren in them, but predominantly they were Gentiles. Look here in Romans 15 in verse 27. It hath pleased them, that is, verse 26, the churches of Macedonia and Achaia, it hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. Let's work through this. For if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal or material things. In a nutshell, here's what it means. How did the gospel get to the Gentile people of the Roman Empire? from Jewish Christians. Okay? The Jewish Christians took the spiritual message to the Gentiles. Now then, these Gentile Christians, they're going to send material assistance back over to Jerusalem to the Jewish saints. And you can almost see a smile on Paul's face. Dealing with racial differences is not always the easiest thing in the world. And so this made Paul happy. Paul was a Jewish man, but he loved all of them equally. And so he thought this was a wonderful thing. And so as we come back to 2 Corinthians 9, as we get to the end of 2 Corinthians 9, we're going to see that there was joy and thanksgiving all around. Why? Well, it was a joy to the givers to be able to help. It was a joy to those brethren over in Jerusalem who received the help. And it's a joy to Paul to be able to see this thing working like it's supposed to work. Okay? And we can learn a lot from that. All right, so let's look chapter 9, verse 1. Man, if we don't get this one right together, something is off. In this chapter, Paul's message is still about ministering to the saints. This ministry still refers to providing for the poor among the saints in, altogether, Jerusalem. All right. Did somebody say McMinn County? 5 push-ups after class. Jerusalem. And again, as we noticed last week, as Paul talked about this equality, maybe in the future, the need will be reversed. All right, number 2. How had Paul used the Corinthian brethren as an example to stir up the churches of Macedonia? Let's read verse 2. For I know the forwardness or willingness of your mind, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many. Basically this thought, hey, if the brethren in Corinth can do it, we ought to be able to do it too. So number 2, how had Paul use that as an example? What had he done? Yeah, he bragged about it. Told the brethren in Macedonia about what the brethren in Corinth were doing, and in our language, those brethren were touched by that kind of zeal. You know, zeal is contagious. So is us sit on the sideline and do nothing, let everybody else do it. That's contagious too. But zeal and get in there and do what we can, that's contagious. And, you know, it really touches us to see these brethren from Macedonia who were in deep poverty, which would make you think, wouldn't they need some help? And yet they were so wanting to help. All right, number 3. Again, how had Paul turned around and used the Macedonian saints to motivate the congregation in Corinth? That's from chapter 8. He told the brethren in Corinth what? Been bragging about you, and the brethren of Macedonia got it. And what, you know, we talked last week quite extensively. When you look back at chapter 8 and verse 2, great trial of affliction, deep poverty. Yet, what's their mentality through all of that? Joy. And not just a little bit, an abundance of joy. And they said, we want to be involved. Really, really a good example for all of us. And again, as we noted earlier, certainly one of the keys is chapter 8 and verse 5. They first gave themselves to the Lord. Now, for our purposes, we're not disregarding it, but for our purposes, right now we're going to put a pause on number 4. We're going to come back, hopefully have time at the end of the lesson. But if we don't have time at the end of the lesson, go back and look at those examples. I'd like you to do that on your own. Okay? Let's go on to number 5. What's the next approach that Paul used to appeal to the brethren in Corinth to get with it, so to speak, and get their gift or contribution ready when? Now. Well, let's look. Let's read that. Verse 3 to 5. Yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf, that as I said, ye may be ready. What's the appeal here? Be ready. Not talking about be ready for the judgment. Be ready what? To give. And don't just say you're ready. Be ready. Get it ready, right? Paul, when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, have the collection ready. What? So when I come, I don't go around house to house and drink tea or whatever it is and use all my time up doing that. Verse 4, lest haply if they of Macedonia come with me and find you unprepared. How would that look? It'd be embarrassing on whose part? The Corinthians, and also it wouldn't make Paul feel good, right? I mean, yes, Paul, are these the ones you're talking about? Yep, I was bragging them up, right? We that we say not ye should be ashamed in this safe, confident boasting. Therefore, verse 5, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren that they would go before unto you. I think this is talking about Titus and those other two brethren, that they come ahead of time and make up beforehand your bounty or generous gift, whereof ye had noticed before that the same might be ready as a matter of bounty, and not as covetousness, or not in a grudging fashion. Okay, so back to our question. Well, what's Paul's next appeal, verses 3 to 5? Yeah, he said, look, I've already put the word out about y'all. Am I going to go back on my word? I said, these brethren in Corinth are going to. So Paul had boasted. It'd be embarrassing to everybody involved. And then also, maybe the unspoken thing here is what? You made a pledge. You keep your word. Now, look, sometimes, we understand this. Sometimes things happen in life that prevent us from carrying out something that we had intended to do and said we would do. Sometimes there may be health issues that arise. Sometimes there may be a person might die before they're able to carry out what they said they would do. But in this case, that was not a factor. Okay? It was, and again, let it be done out as a matter of generosity from the heart, like the brethren in Macedonia, and not just so you might say in our language, just so you can get Paul off your back. Right? That's not the motive for giving. Would the Lord see that? Yeah, sure he would. Yeah, sure he would. Okay, here we go. Let's move along. Number 6. What can help you and me to maintain a healthy attitude toward giving so that we can continue to do it as a matter of generosity, willingly, and not look at it as a grudging obligation? Now, that's not answering. I'm just saying in general. Paul's appeal to them is, look at it as more than just a duty. We talked about this, I think, last week. You and I don't take the Lord's Supper on Sunday simply because it's a command. It is a command. But we do it what? We want to. We do it in remembrance of the Lord. It ought to be the same with giving. Now, you perhaps have observed a child, hopefully not an adult, that when the collection plate, or in some countries it's not a plate, it's a bag, big old deep bag. You perhaps have observed a small child and they've got that money that mom or dad or nana or papa's given to them, and the collection plate or bag comes along and they're just not ready to give that up. It may take a flick of the finger. It may take a pop. It may take, I'm going to take you out and you won't sit down until next week conversation. But you've seen that, and you see that and you're kind of, somebody else's kid is kind of like, but God doesn't want to see that attitude in adults. He doesn't want to look in our hearts and see that we've written a check or our hands putting that money in there, but deep down inside we're thinking, man, I could use this money a lot better ways than this. It just kills me. Well, he's got that x-ray machine. So, I've given you all this time to think about it. So what do you think? What can help us maintain a healthy attitude toward giving? Planning and purposing. And I think we're even going to find a reference to that here in just a moment. Okay, well, let me ask you this. Let's kind of push it back your way to all of us. What ought to motivate me to take that course of action? What ought to motivate me to plan or purpose in giving, because I want giving to be a big part of my life? What should motivate me to do that?
Gratitude for our salvation.
Well, how about that's a really good one? Gratitude for our salvation. You know, we talked last week in chapter 8 about some different ways that Paul had talked about the brethren of Macedonia. Remember verse 9 of chapter 8, that Jesus was rich. You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might be rich spiritually. Yeah, gratitude. That's really good. What's another idea? Love. Yeah, hey, chapter 8, verse 24, this is proof of your love. And again, it oughtn't to be with the attitude, I guess you see my love, God. You saw that, right? God doesn't need us to remind him of what we've done. Okay. I think maybe just to keep in mind the greatness of, we're in the Lord's cause. This is the greatest cause in the world. And there's one financial plan for the Lord's work. And that is, the work is dependent on the generosity of God's people. That's the plan. And so there's that sense of, hey, this is part of being in God's family to do that, and a part of gratitude, and look at the great things that can be done. Okay.
Roger, it's just like you said last week too, when you was talking
Oh,
about
brother.
people in Malaysia, for real, about how when they receive the word, how happy they are and how grateful, and then their spirit is lifted, so it's the same thing as if we give like that.
Oh, yeah. We've all had the experience on, in a limited basis or on a large basis of doing something for somebody. And it could be financial. It could be something that doesn't involve a bit of money. And the joy it brings to those people. We're the ones who are really blessed, right? To be able to do that for them. And so what a great thing that is. You saying that reminds me, I said last week, we had a visitor a couple of weeks ago from members of the church from another part of the state, and we got to talking, and we used to work at the same Bible camp, not around here, a different Bible camp, but not in the same years. And we got to compare names. The preacher there I knew, and he said, wait a minute. He said, did you say you used to preach in Cleveland? He said, I heard you preach once there. He was a friend of a man that used to attend here. He said, and I remember in that sermon you said, and I thought, oh no, what did I say? So, what's number one? It's a reminder that at least some folks are paying attention. And at least some folks are remembering. And, once it goes on the internet, it's on there forever until somebody deletes it. So, all right. Now, look at number 7. In the next phase of Paul's appeal to them about proper giving, what matters does he include? In verse 6, you sow what? You sow sparingly and you reap how? Sparingly. You sow bountifully, you reap bountifully. Now, we understand that principle when it comes to sowing a field of wheat. Well, Paul's going to make that application here in the matter of giving. Yeah, remember now, verse 6 and 7, those are connected with this message about ministering to the saints and getting your collection ready. Let's read those verses. Pretty well known, I think. Verse 6, but this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man, every person, according as he purposeth in his heart. So let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. So number 2 would be on page 33 of our booklet. I got so many notes I can't even say the page number. So from verse 7, let each one give as he what? Purposes in his heart. Somebody want to just give me the second grade definition of what that means? Giving as you purpose in your heart. What does that mean? Predetermination plan. Not spur of the moment. Pre-plan. And the sooner ahead, one could plan it, the better that would be. Whether
This is the guideline for giving in worship?
I think it would be.
Anytime.
Well, I think obviously if we're called upon, at any point in time, we're asked to give. I think we would do well to think that thing through and think, because as congregations and as individuals, there will be opportunities to help. And the reality is, there will be more opportunities to help than we are able as one person, one family, or one congregation to handle ourselves. And so we're going to have to make that judgment call on behalf of ourselves, our family, and the congregation, but with purpose. But I think it definitely would apply to our first day of the week giving. It definitely would. That it should not be just spur of the moment what I've got left over. It ought to be done with putting the Lord first, and that money comes above everything else.
Plan and the purpose would produce a cheerful gift.
I think so.
It all kind of works together.
Yeah, I think it does. And sometimes in life, not talking about giving, but just in life, when you wait till the last minute to do something, you can get flustered and I'll just get it done. And your heart's not in it, and you don't give it your best. But there's a sense. It's not a sense of pride. It's not a sense of boasting. But there's a sense of, hey, this is the way we do it. The money comes in, and either on a piece of paper or in our mind, or maybe even put in an orange or black envelope, that money is set aside, and that's going to be used for the Lord's cause and nothing else. For nothing else. And so there's that aspect of it. Now, look at number 3 then in verse 7. Avoid giving how? Grudgingly or of necessity. In other words, with the sense of what? Well, I don't want to, but I got to. Don't want to, but I got to. And then there's that language in verse 7 that the attitude God loves is one being a what? Cheerful giver. Now here's the thing. One might be a cheerful giver and still be robbing God because of the amount. Because they've convinced themselves that I'm giving sacrificially. I think that's a word that would be appropriate to consider as we consider our giving. The Lord certainly was sacrificial in His giving. In fact, I would suggest that the song that we sing, I gave my life for thee, parts of that song may be appropriate for the Lord's Supper. But I would say part of that song is appropriate in regard to how we give and how we just sacrifice in general for the Lord. Because you know what's unique about that song? In that song, who's doing the talking? Who's the first person I in that song? The Lord is. I gave my life for you. What have you done for me? And it's not, I don't look at that song as a guilt trip. But a look in the mirror it can be a healthy thing. All right, let's go on to the next part here.
One of the things that COVID has brought about as far as giving in congregations, we're leaving it at front when we come in, or front when we leave. They don't pass the plate anymore.
Yes, sir.
So you don't hear the rustling of billfold being open and the checks being ripped down the book and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say you don't hear that during the Lord's Supper. I'll tell you this. One of the children's homes that our brethren support, when they came, I don't know, either 6 months ago or a year ago, when they came on one of their stops to get goods from us, we collect goods from time to time, we asked the brother who was working with that children's home, and he said, we have, even during COVID, he said, our contributions have not slacked off a bit. He said, that's wonderful. He said, brethren have really come through. And so that's a good thing. All right, look at number 8. Paul's next appeal about giving is to reach into your pockets and give, knowing that God supplies what we need and multiplies seed for efforts in his cause. So think of a farmer in the day where you sow the seed, you harvest. Back in the day, what would a farmer do with the seed? Let's say wheat, okay? Let's say wheat, because we can think about the different ways that wheat can be used for food that you don't have to, you can make your own. So you plant the seed, the wheat seed, you harvest the wheat seed. Now, once I harvest that wheat seed as a farmer, what could I do with that? What potential do I have for that? Save some for next crop. Okay, that's one thing. What's another thing I can do? Food on the table. You can make stuff with wheat. And then I might also be able to use that to help out my neighbor. Maybe his crop got washed out. Just because you're in the same county or even on the same road, not all property, not all land property is created equal. Some of it's rocky and some of it's just wet and some of it's rich and some of it's not. So you might be able to use that to assist somebody else. Okay? All right, so let's kind of walk through that. Number 1 there. With the harvest, God provides sufficient what? Seed. Okay? Now, how's that going to apply to this ministering to the saints? Well, the way in which God has blessed them, they can use that seed, so to speak, and share it with others. I'm not talking about the seed, the Word of God here, but just the blessing. Number 2, then, with the harvest, God provides sufficient seed to be used to make what? Bread or food for our own personal consumption. That's not being selfish. It's not being stingy. It's a matter of providing for our own. And so when it comes to finances, then, as we have opportunity, we're to do good unto all men, especially to whom? Household of faith. So we would look first at the needs of family, right? Before we look to, and then number 3, with the harvest, God provides enough seed to be used in doing what? Good or righteous works. That's right. If you look there at the end of verse 8, it's the language of abound to every good work. At the end of verse 10, increase the fruits of your righteousness. I don't think the word righteous here is talking about their personal character, but the way they share what they have with others. And so this contribution, getting the assistance to the poor among the saints in Jerusalem, you see all that. And again, those 2 Old Testament references, just temporarily, we're going to go past those to number 9. Why would the generous contributions made by the brethren result in thanksgiving to God? Let's read verse 11 and 12. Being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth through us what? So again, we're going to zero in. Why would there be thanksgiving? Verse 12. For the administration or the carrying out of this service not only supplieth the want or needs of the saints, but is abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God. So, let's go back to the question. Why would there be thanksgiving? Needs were met. So the brethren over in the Jerusalem area, their needs were met. Thank God. Look, let's pick up a thought here, y'all. I really hammered on this when we studied in chapter 7. Paul said, God comforted us. You remember what he said? How did God do that? By the coming of Titus. The brethren in Jerusalem would be able to say, God supplied our needs. How? By the generous contributions of our brethren. God gets the glory and the instruments. So there's thanksgiving then for the gift received. What else would there be? On Paul's part, Paul would be thankful to see what? To just kind of sit back and observe what's going on. These Gentile Christians helping the Jewish brethren. And not being so concerned about which team they cheer for or what part of the world they live in. But the bottom line is those people have a need. And so their hearts of compassion were open to that. And so as a result of that, Paul had high expectation for the brethren there to give. Now, number 10. In this context, to what does the exceeding grace of God in them refer? It's verse 14. Let me read 13 and then 14. Verse 13. Whilst by the experiment of this ministration, they glorify God for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ. I know the New King James says, for the obedience of your confession to the gospel, and for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all men, and by their prayer for you, which long after you for the exceeding grace of God in you. When I read verse 13, I realize there's a sense in which I need to be a liberal person. I need to be liberal in my giving, generous in my generosity. Now, so what's this grace of God that's in this context? What was God empowering the Christians in Corinth and other places to do? The ability to give. You know, last week we came across that word grace 2 or 3 times, talking about giving. It was a blessing from God that they would be able to give. Now, financially, if a family in Corinth, before their contribution, if they started with, let's just say in our language, they started with $10. And after that contribution, they've only got $8 left. There is, you put 10 minus 2. There's a deficit of $2. So in terms of how much they got left, their bank account's gone down. But has it been a blessing to them to give? It sure has. And is God going to take care of them so that they'll be able not only to survive but to thrive? He sure will. He sure will. Final one. Boy, this is a man. Who writes this long of a question? The Corinthian saints were greatly blessed. God gave them many gifts, including the gift of supplying their material needs, the gift of being able to serve other saints, the gift of the gospel, and the gift of His Son, the Christ. Well, you see in verse 15 it talks about God's unspeakable gift. Doesn't mean it's a secret and don't tell. So our question is, what do you suppose is the indescribable or unspeakable gift that Paul mentions? I'm just asking your thoughts because he doesn't. God's grace led to, okay, let's tie those. God's grace led to salvation provided by the blood that Jesus shed, which motivates us to what? Care about what God wants. And care about our brothers and sisters. And God's grace and God's love motivates us to be the kind of people we need to be. So it all goes back ultimately to the cross and the love and the grace behind it. True or false? Paul had confidence in Titus. True or false? Brother Campbell has confidence in you. True. So I'm going to ask you those questions we didn't do from the Old Testament. So question 4 and question 8 that involve the Old Testament and a couple of verses from the New. Go ahead and look those up if you would and put in your answers. And if somebody will remind us, we'll start there next week because chapter 10, if you've looked at our booklet, it's not a really, we'll be able to do that next week. I've enjoyed it immensely. I hope you have. And so we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Don't forget now, for the super blessed ones, that take-home review will come on the next to last class session.